We started our coverage of Chapter 2 in the last video by talking about ambiguity. In this video, we're going to move on to talk about another linguistic phenomenon, vagueness. We're going to talk about three different ways in which something can be vague. First, an expression is vague if borderline cases for its application occur. Second, vagueness also arises when several criteria exist for application of a term, with no specification of how many criteria have to be fulfilled and to what degree. And third, a lack of specificity is another form of vagueness. If you're not sure what all those things mean quite yet, don't worry, we're going to look at examples of each one. Okay, let's start with this first one. An expression is vague if borderline cases for its application occur. Take the term middle-aged. There are certain ages for which it is clear that the term applies. For example, the age 45. But there are other ages for which it is unclear whether or not they should count as middle-aged because the term has a vague boundary. Is someone who's 37 or 38 or even 40, is that person middle-aged? It gets hard to tell because the boundary is vague. Other examples of words which are vague in this sense include bald, old, rich, happy, and thin. Okay, looking at the second type, vagueness also arises when several criteria exist for application of a term with no specification of how many criteria have to be fulfilled and to what degree. Take a look at this example. April is a good friend. What are the criteria for being a good friend? Can a good friend let you down sometimes? How often or in what ways can someone let you down and still be a friend? Can a good friend take something from you without permission? Some would say yes, but others would not agree, and most would say it depends. So the point is, when we're looking at whether or not someone counts as a good friend, there's lots of different criteria you could use. And these different criteria often come in differing degrees. To what extent, to what degree do you have to have all these different criteria? Do you need to meet all the criteria or just some to be a good friend? It gets hard to tell, and that's what makes a sentence like April is a good friend vague. Lack of specificity is also a way in which expressions can be vague. Think about answers you can give to the question, where do you live? You could say something more general, like, I live in Indiana, or I live in New York. But if the person who asked you that question was hoping to get your address because you invited them over for dinner, the answer you gave isn't very helpful. It's way too vague. Vagueness, like ambiguity, has plenty of positive and neutral uses. However, reducing vagueness is important in some circumstances, such as when vagueness comes into play in certain arguments. Take this little argument. Dolores seldom attends religious services. Therefore, Dolores is not religious. The vague term here that we're looking at is going to be religious. This term seems to be ambiguous in the second sort of way we were talking about. There's a wide variety of criteria that one might use in order to count someone as religious or not. Is seldomly attending religious services really sufficient for someone not to be religious? What if Dolores prays a lot and believes in God but just doesn't go to church that much? Does she still not count as religious? It gets hard to tell. This term seems to be a vague one. Your book notes an important application of whether or not someone counts as religious. Take this example. When all young men in the United States were subject to the draft, conscientious objectors to military service who professed a religion were treated differently from non-religious conscientious objectors. Religious objectors were assigned to alternate non-military service. Non-religious objectors went to jail. So whether or not you count as religious in such a circumstance all of a sudden seems pretty important. So that's what vagueness is. That's something to also keep an eye out for as we're looking at arguments. You don't want to accept a conclusion based on a bad use of a vague term.